Okay, thanks for joining me, folks. At the making of this video, we are in the Christmas season. We're a couple weeks from Christmas at this point. And so I decided I would read a book about Christmas. And this is The Battle for Christmas by Stefan Nissenbaum, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, A Cultural History of America's Most Cherished Holiday. And so it's a history of Christmas in the United States. From the last reading, I stopped on page 78, and I'm going to try to finish chapter 2 in this reading. And very interesting history that we found so far. Christmas developed over time, and now we're getting to the point where the concept of Santa Claus came into Christmas, Santa Claus as we know him today. And that was actually in the 1800s in America. So let's get on with it. The stump of a pipe. And he smokes the stump of a pipe. Now that little detail comes directly from Washington Irving and from none of Moore's other sources, Irving invariably associated St. Nicholas with a pipe. But there was a difference. That pipe was always referred to as a long pipe. Indeed, flamboyantly, my tongue gets twisted. I have a birth defect here. This lip has, there's a nerve missing here. So certain words I have a lot of difficulty pronouncing because that nerve also affects the function of my tongue. And so my tongue gets twisted on some of these words. So please bear with me. Indeed, flamboyantly long, flamboyantly long, the pipe being really long. In Irving's word, a mighty pipe. It is necessary to say something here about the history and politics of pipes, if only because Irving himself does so. Indeed, there is a chapter in Knickerbocker's history that bears the title of The Pipe Plot. This chapter has nothing to do with St. Nicholas. What it deals with is the moment at which New Amsterdam, that is New York, was transformed from a community characterized by ease, tranquility, and sobriety of deportment into a meddlesome and fictitious city. I'm not fictitious, a meddlesome and a factious city. Boy, I'll get that right. A meddlesome and factious city. Irving associated this transformation with the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800, the same political upheaval in which the mob, since called the sovereign people, exhibited a strange desire of governing itself. What happened? Irving reported was that the citizens of New York organized themselves for the first time into two opposing parties. The terms Irving chose to identify these parties are intriguing. The more wealthy and important formed a kind of aristocracy, which went by the appellation long pipes, while the lower orders were branded as the plebeian name of short pipes. Clearly, Irving was suggesting that short pipes were associated with working class radicalism in the early 19th century. Not surprisingly, his suggestion seems to have been accurate. A recent paper delivered by a historical archaeologist who has been studying artifacts from the boarding houses of the cotton mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, bears the improbable, subtle clay pipes and class consciousness. It seems that by the early 19th century, gentlemen smoked long pipes, some as much as 2 feet in length, known as aldermen or church wardens. Workers smoked short pipes or cuties. Interesting. It was not from economic necessity. That is because short pipes happen to be cheaper that working class men and women smoked them. Rather, they did so as a public gesture of class identity. In fact, the archaeological evidence in the form of numerous broken off pipe stems suggests that workers often purchased longer pipes and then proceeded immediately before smoking them to break off the stems. I can see where they're going with that one. The evidence seems compelling. Few of the broken off stems recovered from the Lowell mills bear any telltale tooth marks. Workers chose to smoke the stump of a pipe. Why? Well, they're kind of saying to the aristocracy, forget you. I'm gonna buy one of your long pipes and I'm just gonna snap it and then I'm gonna smoke from it. It's kind of a mockery, if you will, or a defiance. I guess that'd be a better word, a defiance of the aristocracy by doing that. Which finally brings this excursion into literary history back into connection with social history and the analysis of gentile mythology into connection with the social changes that helped to generate it. Remember what was actually happening in the streets of early 19th century New York during the Christmas season. The presence there of marauding bands of revelers who threatened peace and property, whose revelry often turned into riot, who used this annual opportunity to reclaim for themselves, if only symbolically, the fashionable residential territory that had recently become the private preserve of the well-to-do. Remember the example of John Pintard's unsettling experience on New Year's Eve in 1821 when he was kept awake until dawn by the noise of the Callithumpian band that stayed outside his door. Remember Clement Clarke Moore's own anxiety during the same period over the slicing up of his pastoral estate into city streets for rapid development, the result of a plebeian conspiracy of artisans and laborers. Remember that Moore wrote A Visit from St. Nicholas in 1822 when the streets had just been dug and the development begun. Viewed from this angle, there is something resonant about the choices Moore made in writing his little poem, and especially about his decision to both defrock St. Nicholas and declass him, to take away his clerical authority and his patrician manner, and to represent him instead of as a plebeian. Moore's decision meant that his St. Nick resembles, after all, the kind of man who might have come to visit a wealthy New York patrician on Christmas Eve, to startle him out of his slumber with a loud clatter outside his door, perhaps even to enter his house uninvited and unannounced. But there was one dramatic difference. The working class visitor, feared by the patrician, would come in a different way for a different purpose. Such a visitor would have inhabited that murky ground between old style village wassailing and the new urban political violence. He would have been youthful and full sized, not a tiny old F. He would very likely have been part of a roving gang, perhaps a Callithumpian band, not a single individual. He would have come to make all the noise he could rather than to speak not a word, to demand satisfaction, not to give it, to harass or threaten his host, not to reassure him that he had nothing to dread. And if he had finally departed in a genial spirit, wishing in familiar wassail fashion a happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night, it would have been because he had received satisfaction, not because he had offered it. By contrast, the household visitor Moore portrays has come neither to threaten his genteel host, nor to make any demands of his on his generosity. The narrator of A Visit from St. Nicholas is openly fearful when St. Nicholas first appears, but his fears have been assuaged by the time St. Nicholas departs. There's another real life variation on this theme. The houses and shops of well to do men in large urban centers were guarded, as we have seen, by night watchmen, a kind of private police force. As it happens, these watchmen, like other menial workers of the period, took the Christmas season as a time to ask their wealthy patrons for tips. We know this because the watchman's ritual sometimes took the form of a printed broadside, much like the carrier's addresses discussed in Chapter 1. A few of these broadsides, watchmen's addresses, as they were known, have survived. All of them all of them remind their wealthy readers of the sense of security their nocturnal vigilance has managed to provide. And all go on to beg a reward for their efforts. A particularly resonant watchman's address was circulated in 1829 by the watchman of the Philadelphia suburb of Southwark. Headed Southwark Watchman's Address for Christmas Day, it went in part like this. While you're reposing in sleep's fond embrace, upon your rich, soft, downy bed, the watchman, who's one of your own fellow race, sees clouds gathering thick o'er his head. This doth not affright him. His pathway is clear to serve you. He's near seen to stray, to shield you from danger and guard you from fear, propels him alone on his way. The ruffian at midnight is drove from your door by the watch that is fearful and true, and this keeps in safety your house and your store. To him then is gratitude due. Here, the watchman has reminded his patrons that he is protecting them in their rich, soft, downy bed, protecting them indeed from the ruffian who tries to enter in the middle of the night. And in the context of the Christmas season, it is surely significant that the watchman has chosen to speak of a ruffian and not a thief. He shields his prosperous patrons from danger and fear, to be sure, but he also makes demands of his own, demands that take the classic form of a wassail. Now, to close, he wishes you health to farewell, and your might from him hope you won't spare. On such occasions, the watchman, in effect, turned the tables on his ordinary role, symbolically becoming the very personage from whom he is supposed to offer protection. As with any wassail, there was always a veiled edge of threat behind the good wishes. And in this instance, a miserly patron would surely be risking far more than a wet newspaper. But if A Visit from St. Nicholas spoke to the physical fears of its upper class readers, it also addressed their moral guilt. What it suggested was that Santa Claus was one Christmas visitor to whom the patron owed no obligations. not even tips. This visitor asked for nothing, but by implication, his host owes him nothing. An important point. If one is willing to believe that even as late as the 1820s, many patrician New Yorkers still felt a strong, if inchoate, obligation to be generous to the poor during the emotionally resonant holiday season. If Moore's upper class readers were to be comfortable at Christmas time, they needed to have at their disposal a class of dependents whose palpable expressions of goodwill would assure them that they had fulfilled their obligations after all. They did this in part by substituting their own children for the needy and homeless outside their household. In that way, as we have seen, they managed to preserve the structure of an older Christmas ritual in which people occupied positions of social and economic authority, offered gifts to their dependents. The children in their own households had replaced the poor outside it as the symbolic objects of charity and deference. And the gratitude those children displayed at present opening time was a recreation of the old Christmas exchange, gifts of goodwill, gifts for goodwill. The ritual of social inversion was still there, but it now remained securely within the household. Still, that change could easily have been implemented without transforming St. Nicholas from a bishop and a patrician into a plebeian. Indeed, it could have been achieved without introducing St. Nicholas into the picture at all. By representing him as a plebeian, Moore allowed something else to happen. And it's a fascinating transformation. Without losing his role as the bringer of gifts, St. Nicholas has taken on an additional function, that of a grateful, non threatening, old style dependent. In the first of these three roles, as gift bringer, St. Nicholas is purely imaginary, a fiction devised for children, a private joke among adults. More about that in a moment. In the second role, as grateful dependent, he is imaginary in a different way, and only in part. A fiction devised for adults, and hardly as a joke. And imaginary only to the degree that, say, the old Dutch yeomanry, nostalgically described by Washington Irving in Rip Van Winkle or Knickerbocker's history, were imaginary, or the loyal peasants that Irving presented in his Bracebridge Hall stories. Like those fictional characters, more St. Nicholas may not have existed. But in this second row, he, too, was based on a real life prototype that meant a great deal to the upper class New Yorkers who very much wished to believe that he did still exist. In this way, Moore managed to evoke what had eluded his fellow Knickerbockers, Washington Irving and John Pentard, in their own efforts to recapture the spirit of Christmas past. That is, the integration of the social classes in a scene of shared festivity where the poor posed no threat and gratefully accepted their place. Moore did this by replacing the cheerful poor of cherished memory, not just with the children of the household, but also with the magical figure of St. Nicholas himself. With this trickery maneuver, Moore managed to transform what had been merely archaic and sentimental, and also patronizing to the poor, into something that can be called mythic. In order to negotiate that transformation, to create that myth, Moore had to make the two simple yet crucial changes I have described. He had to present St. Nicholas as a figure who would evoke in his hearers and readers a working class image, and not a patrician one. and also as a figure who would act the patrician's part and not the workers. He had to present St. Nicholas in the role of a bishop, without a bishop's authority to stand in judgment. In short, More had to present St. Nicholas as more a bishop and a worker, but without either the power of the one or the animosity of the other. He had to devote fully 1/3 of his poem to offering the reassurance that the people who received visits from this figure of the night would have nothing to dread. St. Nicholas first offers the reassurance by giving a wink of his eye and a twist of his head. And a little later, when he has filled all the stockings and is about to depart, he turns abruptly to face the narrator, the head of the household, or in other words, us, the reader, and places his finger aside of his nose. This is a meaningless phrase today, but in the late 18th and early 19th century, the gesture seems to have represented the equivalent of a secret wink, a visual way of saying something like, shh, I'm only kidding, or let's keep it between the two of us. In the illustration on page 80, the man seated on the left is making this very gesture to the man on the right, who is laughing so hard at the other man's joke that he has dropped his long pipe. In fact, the source of Santa's gesture in A Visit from St. Nicholas was a passage in Irving's Knickerbocker's History, a passage in which St. Nicholas appears in a dream to a character named Van Cortlandt. The dream concludes with these words. And when St. Nicholas had smoked his pipe, he twisted it in his hat band, and laying his finger beside his nose, gave the astonished Van Cortlandt a very significant look. Then, mounting his wagon, he returned over the treetops and disappeared. Soon, More was obviously alluding to this passage, and St. Nicholas gestured in his poem. 2. Can be understood as a signal to the narrator and to all adult readers of the poem. This is all a dream, as if to say, we know I don't exist, but let's keep that between you and me. Excuse me, I'm looking at page 80 real quick. See that? That's what that is. Okay. I don't know if I can get it on camera, but I'll give it a shot so you can kind of see the picture. Let me see if I can get it on here. Oh, there it was. Let me back it off. Where are you? There. Oh, right there. There's the picture. All right. Hopefully that was good enough. All right. You can always pause it and get a closer look. There are a lot of pictures and illustrations in here. Now this is Back to the Future, 87, and we are almost done with the chapter, so we're going to finish it up. All a dream. For the upper class New Yorkers who collectively invented Christmas, More's quite little achievement was especially resonant. It offered a Christmas scenario that took a familiar ritual, the exchange of generosity for goodwill, and transfigured it with a symbolic promise to release them from both the fear of harm and the pressure of guilt. A generation earlier, one might argue, the parents of these men were sufficiently in control of their social world not to require such a catharsis. Catharsis, excuse me. A generation later, their children were sufficiently purged of a sense of direct social obligation not to require it any longer. By then, in any case, a visit from St. Nicholas would be taking on new meanings. Santa Claus himself would lose his plebeian character as time passed, and as the poem, the new kind of holiday it helped create, was taken over by the middle classes and even by the poor themselves. In the years to come, even the visual image of Santa Claus would change. Still plebeian in the 1840s, Santa and his team soon ceased to be portrayed as a miniature 8 tiny reindeer and a miniature sleigh and a jolly old elf. He becomes full size, even large. His beard turns into a full gray beard of the late Victorian Bourgeois. He appears increasingly avuncular, and in his hands of Thomas Nast, the famous cartoonist who was responsible for much of this change. Over a period of 18 years, even his pipe grows long once again. Still, for all these changes, Santa Claus recovers none of the episcopal dignity that Clement More took from him in 1822. Between being a jolly plebeian elf and a jolly fat uncle, the real St. Nicholas would surely have found it difficult to choose. The versatile saint would be put to other uses too. The late 19th century was a period of vexing religious doubt for many middle class Americans, and one characteristic solution was to think that God must exist simply because people so badly needed him to. Without God, human life would be simply unendurable. It should not be too surprising that this rather alleged Victorian argument came to apply to Santa Claus as well. In 1897, in reply to an inquiry posed by a young reader whose little friends had told her that Santa Claus did not exist, the New York Sun printed what was destined to become a classic editorial. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus, the editorial began. It was written by the newspaper's religious affairs reporter, and its language and tone self-consciously mirror that of late Victorian popular theology. Virginia, your little friends are wrong. The reporter insisted, explaining that they have been affected by the skepticism of the skeptical age. And he went on to stake out terrain that many of his adult readers would have found familiar from sermons they heard in church. Alas, how dreary would be the world if were no Santa Claus, the reporter argued. There would be no childlike faith then, no poetry, no romance to make tolerable this existence. And he concluded, no Santa Claus, thank God he lives and he lives forever. I'll read it again. No Santa Claus? Question mark. No Santa Claus? Thank God he lives and he lives forever. All right. Clement More wrote A Visit from St. Nicholas on what might be called the cusp of his life. The expansion of New York affected him in a direct way, breaking up his estate into city blocks. Let me go back. The expansion of New York affected him in a direct way, breaking up his estate into city blocks. Before around 1820, he viewed this change as a threat and protested it accordingly. But after More adopted a different strategy, he stopped protesting the new conditions and began instead to protect his economic and social position by systematically controlling the development of the Chelsea district. As early as 1818, He donated an entire city block adjacent to his own house for the construction of an Episcopal theological seminary, the institution in which he later became a professor of Hebrew and ancient languages. And he gave another large parcel for a new and a very elegant Episcopal church, St. Peter's. By doing this, More was able to protect the value of his remaining holdings in Chelsea, and during the following years, he consciously controlled the development of those holdings by leasing lots rather than selling them, and by including restrictive covenants in the deeds he gave to builders. Under More's careful direction, Chelsea became, for a time, a fashionable district, an oasis of respectability on New York's West Side. As a great Manhattan landowner, Clement Moore played a part in the emergence of a new urban landscape, a landscape that stratified and segregated the city by wealth and class, and in which housing itself became a commodity. What I have tried to suggest in this chapter, oh, excuse me, what I have tried to suggest in this chapter is less easy to prove. That More helped to bring about a parallel change on the American cultural landscape. In the role for which he is best known to most Americans today as the poet of Christmas Eve. If such a reading is correct, it was that which constituted his most important contribution to the history of American capitalism. Wow. Wow. It would appear, my friends, there's a lot more to Christmas, at least our modern Christmas rituals and traditions, than we had anticipated. Well, I can't wait to get into more of these. I'll be starting chapter 3 in the next reading, and it goes all the way from page 90 to page 131. So it'll take several readings to get through chapter 3. Well, thank you for watching. I have already picked out the book I want to read next after I finish this one about Christmas. This will probably be finished, I would say, early February or toward the end of February. By the time winter starts to turn into spring, this book will be finished. And the next one will be Heaven Misplaced, Christ's Kingdom on Earth by Douglas Wilson. That should be an interesting book. It's not a very thick book. It wouldn't take very long to read it. So I chose to do that one because I haven't read it, and it looks very interesting. Now we're going to get into some history too, and I'm going to do that. So this channel is just going to go all over the place as far as it's going to be a channel of books. How's that? This is your library on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you here on the C-Files the next time. God bless. Take care.